where do you think the word assassin comes from? The answer is unsettling. In the year 1092, in a remote castle in northern Persia, a religious mystic named Hasan-i-Sabah began one of the strangest experiments in the history of warfare. He had no army. He had no territory worth fighting for. He had at most a few hundred devoted followers in a kingdom of tens of millions. But over the next 30 years, by killing only a small handful of carefully chosen people, Hasan-i-Sabah made the most powerful empire of the medieval world tremble. They negotiated with him, they paid him, they left him alone. His followers were called Hashashin, and the word, traveling west with the Crusaders, slowly transformed into one of the darkest words in any modern language. Robert Greene saves the story of Hasan for the very last chapter of the 33 Strategies of War, because it teaches a lesson the rest of the book has been preparing you for. We've come to the darkest part of the book. In part 1, we walked through the strategies of the inner war, how to know yourself, master your own mind, choose your battles. In part 2, we walked through the strategies of going on the offensive, how to think in campaigns, hit at the source, finish what you start. Both of those parts assumed something. They assumed that the wars you find yourself in are clean, that the people across from you are operating in good faith, that the contest, however fierce, is still a contest with rules. Part 3 of the 33 Strategies of War is for the wars that are not clean. Robert Greene argues, and this is the most uncomfortable claim in the entire book, that the most dangerous opponents most of us will ever face are people who never declare war. They smile, they agree with you, they show up to the meeting on time, they appear to be on your team, even on your side, and while they are doing all of these things, they are quietly running campaigns of misdirection, manipulation, and indirect attack against you. They are using strategies that are thousands of years old, and almost nobody has been taught to recognize them. This is part 3 of 3. Over the next 50 minutes, I'll walk you through the final 11 strategies in Greene's masterpiece, the strategies of unconventional, indirect, and dirty warfare. We'll move through 4 movements. First, the strategies of twisting reality, how aggressive people manipulate what you think you're seeing. Second, the indirect game, how small forces beat large ones, and how seemingly cooperative allies are sometimes the most dangerous threat. Third, the strategies of quiet conquest, how people advance against you so slowly you don't notice until they've already won. And fourth, the end game, the most extreme strategies in the book, including the one that gave us the word assassin. These are not strategies most of you would ever choose to use, but they are being used on you right now by people in your life you have not yet learned to see. Once you have learned to see them, almost nothing in your daily life will look the same. And that by itself is a more useful gift than anything else this book can offer. So let's start with the first thing aggressive people do. They make you see what isn't there. Section 1. Twisting reality. In the spring of 1944, in a quiet stretch of rural England southeast of London, a strange army was assembling. From above, from a German reconnaissance plane, it looked formidable. There were tanks, hundreds of them. There were trucks, fuel depots, long, neat rows of artillery pieces in their assigned positions. There were tents, cooking fires at the right times of day. There were radio transmissions going back and forth between division headquarters all day long. The kind of low-priority traffic any army generates. Supply requests, leave applications, payroll forms, complaints about the food. The army was called the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It was commanded by General George S. Patton, the most aggressive, feared American commander of the entire war. It had over 1 million men in it, and from what German intelligence could tell, it was going to land in northern France any day now, at the narrowest point of the English Channel, the Pas de Calais. None of it was real. The tanks were rubber. They were inflatable, like beach toys, and they could be moved at night by 3 men. The artillery pieces were wooden mock-ups. The The trucks had been built by film studio set designers. The radio transmissions were real, but they were broadcasting nothing of military value. Just enough chatter to convince a listening German that an army of over 1 million men was generating exactly that much paperwork. Patton was real. He had been deliberately stationed in southeast England where German intelligence could spot him. He drove around in his jeep. He attended fake meetings. He gave fake speeches. He played the role of the man who was about to lead an invasion that was never going to happen. The whole production, and it was a production designed by film professionals as much as by generals, was called Operation Fortitude. Its single purpose was to make Adolf Hitler believe that the Allied invasion of Europe was going to land at the Pas de Calais, when in fact it was going to land 200 miles to the west, at Normandy. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies landed 150,000 men on the beaches of Normandy. Hitler had 50 divisions in northern France. If even half of them had been positioned at Normandy, the invasion would have been driven back into the sea within days. But Hitler did not move them. He was so convinced, so deeply, completely convinced, that the real attack was still coming at the Pas de Calais, that for weeks after Normandy he kept his best armored divisions sitting 200 miles up the coast, waiting for the second invasion that never came. By the time he understood what had actually happened, Allied troops were already pouring across France. The war in Europe was effectively decided. Now think about why that worked. The Allies did not just create a fake army. Anyone could have done that, and Hitler, paranoid, suspicious, would have seen through it. The genius of Operation Fortitude was something else. The Allies had spent years studying Hitler. They knew what he already believed. They knew that he had, on his own, decided that the Pas de Calais was the most likely landing site because it was the shortest crossing and the closest target to Germany itself. They knew his ego was invested in being right about that. So they did not invent a deception. They built a deception that confirmed what he already wanted to believe. They gave him the picture his own mind was already painting and let his mind do the rest of the work. This is what Greene calls the misperception strategy. And the principle is, on its surface, simple. People do not see reality. They see what they expect to see. They filter the world through what they already believe, what they already fear, what they already hope. The skilled deceiver does not fight this. The skilled deceiver works with it. If you want to mislead someone, you do not invent a story they have to swallow. You find the story they are already telling themselves, and you give them the evidence that confirms it. They do the rest. In your own life, this is being done to you all the time, not in such elaborate ways, but constantly. The colleague who knows you are afraid of looking incompetent and feeds you exactly the kind of feedback that confirms it. The salesperson who knows you want to feel smart and structures the pitch so that buying the product feels like the smart person choice. The political message that knows what you already fear and gives you a target for that fear. The most effective manipulation is not the one that makes you believe something new. It is the one that makes you believe more firmly what you already half believed. So here is the recognition skill. When something feels too perfectly aligned with what you already think, when a piece of information lands too neatly on top of your existing beliefs, pause, suspect it, ask yourself, would I be this convinced if this told me something I didn't want to hear? The truth is rarely that clean. The truth almost always comes with friction, with contradictions, with elements that don't fit your model of the world. When information arrives without that friction, when it slips into your mind so smoothly that you barely notice you've absorbed it, that is when you have to be most careful. Because the smooth fit is the signature of a deception built around what you wanted to see. Hitler had 50 divisions in the wrong place because the picture he was looking at confirmed what he already believed. You don't have 50 divisions, but you have your time, your trust, your money, your attention. All of them are stationed right now somewhere in your life, and the question is whether you put them there or whether someone else did by giving you a picture that fit too neatly. But misperception is only the first weapon in twisting reality. The second is harder to see, because it doesn't trick you about what is happening. It does something stranger. It does what you think is impossible. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, on a flat plain in southern Italy, the largest army Rome had ever assembled was about to walk into the most devastating defeat in its history. The army was 80,000 men strong. The Romans had spent months raising it, training it, supplying it. Its mission was simple and overdue. For 2 years, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal had been wandering loose in Italy, defeating every Roman force sent against him. He had crossed the Alps with elephants. He had ambushed and destroyed an entire Roman army at Lake Trasimene. The Romans had finally decided that the only solution was overwhelming force. They would meet Hannibal in open battle with twice his numbers and end the war in a single day. Hannibal had only 50,000 men. He was outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. By every conventional measure of warfare in the ancient world, he had no business winning. The Romans, when they marched onto the plain at Cannae that morning, were completely confident. Now look at how Hannibal had drawn up his army. He had placed his weakest troops, a force of poorly trained Gauls and Spaniards, in the center of his line. He had placed his best soldiers, his elite Carthaginian veterans, on the wings. He had positioned his cavalry on the far flanks, and he had drawn the line itself in a strange shape, not flat, the way armies always lined up, but curved slightly forward in the middle, like a shallow bow. The Romans saw this and saw exactly what they expected to see: a weak center, an overconfident enemy who didn't understand basic battlefield geometry. The obvious move was to attack the center hard with everything they had. The Carthaginian line would collapse, the Romans would burst through, and the battle would be over by lunch. So they attacked. The Roman legions, packed densely shoulder to shoulder, drove into Hannibal's center. The Gauls and Spaniards, exactly as Hannibal had planned, started to give ground. They retreated step by step, in good order. The Roman commander, watching from the rear, was thrilled. The center was breaking. He pushed more troops in. More. What he could not see, from where he was standing, was that Hannibal's curved line was no longer curving forward. As the center retreated, the line bowed backward, first flat, then into a shallow U-shape, then deeper. The Romans charging in kept pushing. They were now packed tightly into a sack-shaped formation, with Hannibal's elite Carthaginian veterans on either side of them, not retreating, holding firm. On the wings, Hannibal's cavalry had crushed the smaller Roman cavalry units and ridden around to the rear of the Roman position. Just as the bulk of the Roman army committed itself fully into the U-shape, just as it became impossible for them to back out, the Carthaginian cavalry slammed into them from behind. The two flanks of Hannibal's elite infantry closed in from the sides. The Romans were surrounded, 80,000 men, packed shoulder to shoulder, suddenly inside a Carthaginian box. What happened over the next several hours is one of the worst things human beings have ever done to each other. The Romans were so densely packed in the middle of the formation that many of them could not raise their swords. They could not turn, they could not retreat. The Carthaginians on the outer ring methodically killed them, one rank at a time, working inward for the rest of the day. By sunset, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were dead on the field at Cannae. Hannibal had lost about 6,000 men. The numbers were so lopsided that for the next 2,000 years, military academies all over the world have studied the Battle of Cannae as the textbook example of what is possible when a commander does what no one expects. Now look at how Hannibal won. He did not win because he was stronger. He wasn't. He did not win because he had better troops everywhere. He didn't. His center was deliberately weaker than the Roman center. He won because he set up a situation in which the Romans did exactly what they always did, and exactly what they always did, in this specific situation, destroyed them. This is what Greene calls the ordinary extraordinary strategy, and the principle behind it is the deepest idea in Eastern military thought. Sun Tzu wrote about it 2,500 years ago. The idea is that there are two kinds of moves in any conflict: the ordinary move, the move your opponent expects, the conventional and predictable move, and the extraordinary move, the move nobody anticipates, the move that breaks the pattern. The amateur strategist either uses only ordinary moves, in which case they are predictable and easy to defeat, or they use only extraordinary moves, in which case they are unpredictable but exhausting and unsustainable. The master strategist uses the ordinary to set up the extraordinary. They establish a pattern that lulls the opponent into expecting more of the same. And then, at the moment of decision, they break the pattern. Hannibal's curved line was the ordinary move dressed up to look like a tactical mistake. The Romans saw a familiar situation, a weakly held center, and responded with their familiar tactic. Hannibal had spent the last 2 years training them, through his other battles, to expect Carthaginian armies to fight conventionally. So at the moment of crisis, when the Romans were committed and could not change course, Hannibal's revealed that his line was not a line at all. It was a trap. In your own life, this works in ways that are quieter, but just as effective. If you are predictable in conflict, if you always argue the same way, always defend the same points, always respond to provocation with the same kind of counterattack, the people in your life have already learned how to beat you. They've seen the pattern, they've trained against it. They know what you'll do before you do it. The way to break this is not to be unpredictable in everything. That looks erratic and untrustworthy. The way is to be steady and predictable in 90% of your behavior. And then, at the one moment that matters, do something nobody expected. Most of the time, you are reasonable. Most of the time, you respond predictably. Most of the time, you behave like the person everyone expects you to be. But every now and then, at the moment when a conflict is truly being decided, you do the thing that nobody saw coming. You walk away when everyone expected you to fight. You agree when everyone expected you to refuse. You publicly say the thing nobody believed you'd ever say. You make the move that in retrospect, everyone realizes you had been quietly setting up for years. That is the moment when the Romans walk into the curved line. That is the moment when ordinary becomes extraordinary. And that is, almost always, the moment when the conflict ends in your favor. So you can twist your enemy's perception of reality. You can break their assumptions about what you'll do next. The third strategy in this section is about the most powerful weapon in any disagreement, and one of the most dangerous, because the people who use it almost never know they're using it. On the morning of October 31st, 1517, an unknown German monk named Martin Luther walked up to the heavy wooden door of the castle church in the small town of Wittenberg in eastern Germany. He had with him a piece of paper. On it were written 95 propositions, short, sharp, scholarly statements, arguing that the Catholic Church had become deeply, fundamentally corrupt. He nailed them to the door. The door was the public bulletin board of the town. Anyone walking past could read what he had written. Luther was, in every measurable sense, a nobody. He was a 33-year-old Augustinian friar in a small university town, far from Rome, far from Paris, far from any center of power. The institution he was attacking, the Roman Catholic Church, was the most powerful organization in the European world. It controlled the spiritual lives of every Christian on the continent. It owned vast amounts of land. It commanded armies. It had the ear of every king. By every conventional logic of the age, Luther's 95 theses should have been ignored, and Luther himself should have been quietly silenced and forgotten. He wasn't. Within 5 years, Martin Luther had broken the spiritual unity of Europe in half. Within 30 years, he had triggered the Reformation, the bloodiest series of religious wars in European history, and the permanent fracture of Western Christianity. The most powerful institution on earth had been brought to its knees, and the man who did it had no army, no money, no political authority of any kind. What he had, and what made him impossible to defeat, was the moral high ground, and he had taken it first. Look at what Luther was actually fighting about. The specific issue was a church practice called the sale of indulgences. The Pope at the time was raising money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. To do this, church agents were traveling through Europe, selling pieces of paper that supposedly remitted the buyer's time in purgatory. Pay enough money, the pitch went, and your sins would be forgiven. Pay enough, and your dead relatives could be released from suffering. Luther looked at this and saw something the church didn't quite see. Not just that it was theologically wrong, though he believed it was, but that it was, on its face, morally bankrupt. It was selling salvation. The most powerful institution on earth was trading God's forgiveness for cash. Luther did not write his 95 Theses as a critique of church administration. He did not write them as a debate over fine points of doctrine. He wrote them as a moral indictment. The church was selling something it had no right to sell. He was simply naming the corruption. He was simply telling the truth. Now watch what happened next. The church, faced with this critique, had two options. Option 1, ignore it. But the theses were already spreading. Printed copies were appearing in cities across Germany within weeks. To ignore them would be to let them define the conversation. Option 2, respond to Luther. But responding meant engaging with his argument, and his argument was that the church was morally compromised. To engage with it was to elevate it. To attack Luther personally was to look like exactly what he was accusing them of being, a corrupt institution silencing a man telling the truth. The church chose to attack. They tried Luther for heresy. They demanded he recant. The Pope issued a papal bull excommunicating him in 1520. Luther burned the papal bull in a public bonfire. In April of 1521, Luther was summoned to the city of Worms to stand before the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Charles V, the most powerful secular ruler in Europe. The room was full of cardinals, princes, electors. Luther was asked, formally, whether he would recant his writings. He stood, a single monk in a black robe, in front of the assembled power of Christendom. He said this, "Unless I am convinced by Scripture and plain reason, I do not accept the authority of popes and councils, for they have contradicted each other. My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything. Here I stand. I can do no other." He was excommunicated. He was declared an outlaw. Any subject of the empire could legally kill him, but by then it was too late. His words were already being read in every German-speaking city in Europe. German princes, many of whom had their own reasons to resent Roman authority, had begun to side with him. Within a few years, half of Germany had broken with Rome. Within a decade, England had broken with Rome. The man who started it, a single monk who had no power except a piece of paper nailed to a church door, had won. He had broken the most powerful institution in Europe. He had done it by claiming the moral high ground first, and never giving it back. Now this is where Greene's lesson becomes complicated. On one hand, Luther was a hero. He was right. The church was selling indulgences. The corruption was real. His moral high ground was earned, and the principle works again and again in human history. Gandhi used it against the British Empire. Martin Luther King Jr. used it against segregation. Almost every great moral movement in history has won by claiming the moral high ground first and refusing to surrender it. But here is the dark side. The moral high ground, as a strategic position, can be claimed by people who don't actually deserve it. It can be performed by people who are not actually principled. It can be weaponized by people who are using moral language to gain power, not to defend truth. We have all encountered this in our own lives. The colleague who frames every disagreement as a moral failing on your part. The family member who turns every dispute into a question of who is the better, kinder, more reasonable person. The opponent who manages every single time to make their position sound like the only ethical one available. These people are not Martin Luther. They are using the strategic shape of Martin Luther's move without the truth that made his move legitimate. So how do you tell the difference? How do you know when someone has earned the moral high ground and when they're just claiming it as a tactic? One signal, the most reliable one: the genuinely principled person can tolerate dissent. They can, even when they believe deeply in their position, hear the other side without falling apart. They can sit in a conversation where their core belief is challenged and stay calm. The person who is performing virtue cannot do this. The performer requires you to agree immediately, completely, or you become the villain. The performer does not tolerate doubt. The performer does not allow questions. The moment you pause, the moment you say, "Wait, let me think about this," you are accused of being on the wrong side. That is the signature. The principled person can lose an argument and still be principled. The performer cannot afford to. Greene's deeper point about the moral high ground is this: it is one of the most powerful weapons in human conflict, and like all powerful weapons, it can be used by people you would not want to give such a weapon to. When you find yourself in a fight that has been moralized, when the question has shifted from what is true to who is the better person, you are no longer arguing about what you thought you were arguing about. You are now in a fight over moral position, and the only way to win that fight, sometimes, is to refuse to play, to say calmly that you are not going to be drawn into a contest over whose values are purer, to insist on returning to the actual question. Most performative moralists cannot survive that move because their position depends on the moral framing. Take the framing away, and they have nothing left to fight with. So you can twist perception, you can break expectations, you can claim the moral high ground. But there are wars where none of these strategies are enough. Wars where you are simply too small, too outnumbered, too overmatched to win on any conventional ground. For those wars, Greene reaches for the second movement of Part 3, the strategies of the indirect game. Section 2. The indirect game. In the summer of 1916, a 30-year-old British Army intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence found himself in the middle of the Arabian desert, listening to a man named Faisal explain why his army was about to lose the war. Lawrence was an unlikely soldier. Before the war, he had been an Oxford archaeologist. He had spent his 20s wandering through Syria and Mesopotamia, studying ruins, sleeping in Bedouin tents, learning Arabic. When the British Army needed someone who could speak the language and find a way to support the Arab tribes who had recently risen up against the Ottoman Empire, they sent him because they had no one else. Faisal was the leader of the uprising. His army was a few thousand Bedouin tribesmen, armed mostly with antique rifles, fighting on camels. The Ottoman Empire had garrisoned 25,000 professional soldiers in the city of Medina alone, with railways supplying them, with artillery, with everything a modern army needed. Faisal told Lawrence plainly that his men could not take Medina. They had tried, they had been slaughtered. The uprising was about to collapse. Lawrence rode out into the desert that night and thought about the problem for several days. What he came back with was an idea that broke every conventional rule of warfare. "You are trying," he told Faisal, "to do what regular armies do. You are trying to take territory. You are trying to capture cities. You are trying to defeat the Turks in battles. Stop all of that. We are not strong enough to take Medina. We are not strong enough to take any city. So we are not going to try." Lawrence's idea, and Faisal accepted it because nothing else was working, was to fight a war of nothing. Don't take territory. Make the Turks defend territory they cannot defend. Don't attack their main armies. Attack the things their main armies depend on. Hit the railway lines that supply Medina. Blow up the trains. Burn the bridges. Vanish into the desert before the Turks can respond. The next week, hit a different stretch of railway, 200 miles away. Vanish again. Don't ever, under any circumstances, hold a position. Don't ever defend anything. Don't ever let the Turks find your army to fight it. Be everywhere, be nowhere, bleed them by 1,000 small wounds until they cannot afford to be in Arabia anymore. For the next 2 years, this is exactly what Faisal's Arab army did. Lawrence rode at the head of camel raiding parties, sometimes 100 men, sometimes 300, deep into the desert. They blew up over 70 stretches of the Hejaz Railway. They captured Turkish supply convoys and disappeared with them. In 1917, Lawrence personally led a force of 50 men across 200 miles of desert that everyone, including the Turks, considered impassable, and seized the port city of Aqaba from its undefended landward side. By 1918, the Ottoman army in Arabia was no longer fighting an enemy. It was hemorrhaging. Soldiers were starving in their fortified positions because no supply train could reach them. Garrisons were surrendering without a fight because they had not been paid in months and had no idea where their commanders were. In October of 1918, Faisal's forces, with Lawrence at their side, rode into Damascus. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the Middle East for 400 years, collapsed within weeks. Now here is what Greene wants you to see. Lawrence did not win his war by being stronger. He never was stronger. He won by becoming impossible to fight. He gave the Turks no army to attack, no city to defend, no clear front to hold. He turned himself into mosquitoes, 1,000 small painful bites that nobody could swat. The Turks, with all their advantages, could only defend everything, all the time, against an enemy that was always somewhere else, and eventually, the cost of defending everything broke them. This is what Greene calls the void strategy, and it is the strategy of every underdog in human history who has ever defeated a giant. When you face an opponent who is bigger than you, better resourced than you, more powerful than you in every measurable way, do not engage them on their ground. Do not try to win the fights they want to fight. They will crush you. The void strategy is the opposite. You refuse to give them a target. You move when they move. You disappear when they look for you. You hit only the things they didn't think they needed to defend, and only when they are looking somewhere else. You do not win by being stronger. You win by becoming so frustrating to fight that the giant eventually decides the war is not worth it. In your own life, this works whenever you find yourself dramatically outmatched. In an unwinnable argument with someone more powerful than you, stop arguing. Don't engage. Refuse to be drawn into the fight on their terms. They will tire faster than you because they need the fight more than you do. In a competitive field where you are smaller than the established players, don't try to do what they do. Find the small spaces they don't bother defending, the customers they ignore, the work they consider beneath them. Build your strength in the places they aren't watching. By the time they notice, you will be too embedded to dislodge. But there is a second indirect strategy, and it is even older than the void. It is the strategy of getting someone else to fight your war for you. In the year 1474, two cousins were preparing to destroy each other. One of them was Charles, Duke of Burgundy, known to history as Charles the Bold. He had inherited what was, at the time, one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in Europe. His army was professional, well paid, equipped with the best artillery on the continent. He was 34 years old, ambitious, and openly planning to expand his realm by conquering territory in modern-day Switzerland and Germany. The other man was Charles's cousin, King Louis XI of France. Louis was, by every external measure, the inferior of the two. France was still a feudal patchwork. His army was smaller. He himself was a strange figure, frugal almost to the point of poverty, dressed in shabby peasant clothing, eating plain food, openly disliking warfare. The European nobility considered him a joke. What they did not understand was that Louis had spent the previous decade doing something none of them noticed. He had been quietly cultivating a relationship with the Swiss cantons, the small mountain communities to the east of Burgundy. The Swiss were not a great power. Their armies were peasant militias. Their political structure was primitive. Most kings ignored them. Louis didn't. Louis treated them with extraordinary respect. He sent them gifts. He signed favorable trade treaties. He spoke of them publicly as equals. He did not in the moment ask for anything in return. When Charles the Bold finally moved against the Swiss in 1474, hoping to absorb their territory before invading further into Germany, the Swiss were not alone. Louis had quietly funded them. He had supplied them with money, with weapons, with intelligence about Burgundian troop movements. The Swiss did not need to win quickly. They only needed to bleed Charles long enough for his ambitions to collapse. In 1476, the Swiss destroyed a Burgundian army at the Battle of Grand Sun. Charles assembled another, larger army and marched against them again. They destroyed that one too, at Merton, killing nearly half of Charles's men in a single afternoon. In January of 1477, with his treasury empty and his armies in tatters, Charles the Bold tried to besiege the small town of Nancy with what was left of his forces. The Swiss fell on him in the snow. Charles's body was found 2 days after the battle, frozen, half eaten by wolves, identifiable only by the rings on his fingers. Within months, Louis had moved his armies into Burgundy and absorbed most of Charles's territory into the French crown. He had won a decade-long war against the most powerful man in Europe without ever fighting a major battle himself. He had won it by spending 15 years carefully cultivating someone who, when the moment came, was willing to fight Charles for him. This is the alliance strategy, and the principle behind it is uncomfortable, but profoundly useful. In any conflict you face, your direct power is limited. Your time is limited. Your energy is limited. Your reputation is fragile. If you fight every battle yourself, you will lose more than you win, even when you are right. But almost every conflict has a third party, someone with their own grievance against your opponent, someone whose interests, properly understood, align with yours, someone who, given the right encouragement at the right moment, will gladly do the fighting you cannot afford to do yourself. The strategist's job is to find that person, to cultivate them, to make their cause and yours look like the same cause, and then, at the right moment, to step back and let them act. Most people are uncomfortable with this. It feels manipulative. It feels indirect. But notice the alternative. The alternative is to fight every battle in your life directly, by yourself, exhausting your reputation and your energy on conflicts you didn't have to take on. Louis XI lived a very long life and died as the most powerful king in Europe. Charles the Bold died at 36, frozen in the snow. They were cousins. They were the same age. The difference between them was that one of them learned to use other people's strength. But the most subtle strategy in this section is the third one. And unlike the first two, this one is being used on you all the time by people you have not yet learned to recognize. In the autumn of 1862, in the second year of the American Civil War, a politically ambitious Illinois congressman named John McClernand made what looked like a brilliant move. McClernand had no military experience worth mentioning. He had been a state legislator, then a congressman before the war began. When Lincoln needed senior officers willing to commit politically, McClernand had volunteered, and Lincoln had made him a brigadier general. By 1862, he was serving in Tennessee under a general named Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet, shabby-looking officer that McClernand privately considered his inferior in every way. McClernand's real ambition was to be president of the United States someday. The Civil War, in his mind, was a stage. He needed his own great victory, and he had identified the target, the Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. Whoever took Vicksburg would be a national hero. In September, McClernand traveled to Washington and went directly to the White House. He told Lincoln, privately, that Grant was a drunk who could not be trusted with such an important campaign. McClernand himself, he proposed, should be allowed to recruit his own army back in Illinois and lead it down the Mississippi to take Vicksburg. Lincoln, harassed by the war and tired of his generals, agreed. He gave McClernand vague but real authorization to recruit. He did not tell Grant. McClernand returned to Illinois, raised the troops he had been promised, and sent them down to Memphis to assemble for the Vicksburg campaign. What he did not know was that Grant had heard rumors of his backroom maneuvering almost immediately. Grant was famously slow to anger and famously quick to think. He did not confront McClernand. He did not write angry letters to Washington. He did something more subtle. Grant simply moved first. He took the troops McClernand had recruited, troops who, when they arrived in Memphis, were technically under Grant's overall command, and reorganized them under his own subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman. By the time McClernand arrived in Memphis to take command of his army was already gone. McClernand was furious. He wrote letters of complaint. He demanded explanations. He made enemies of every senior officer in the theater. Grant, watching all of this, did not punish him. He simply gave McClernand small, controlled assignments and let McClernand keep humiliating himself. McClernand wrote bombastic dispatches, taking sole credit for battles his subordinates had won. He picked fights with other generals. He sent self-congratulatory letters to northern newspapers. In June of 1863, McClernand published a public statement claiming personal credit for a battle in which his corps had played a minor and somewhat embarrassing role. The statement was so blatantly self-promoting that it gave Grant exactly the pretext he needed. Grant relieved McClernand of command. Within weeks, McClernand was sent home. His political career, which he had been so carefully building, was over. Grant went on to take Vicksburg, became Lincoln's most trusted general, and eventually became the 18th President of the United States. Now look at how Grant won that fight. He did not attack McClernand directly. He never publicly criticized him. He never tried to discredit him. He simply gave McClernand enough room to discredit himself. McClernand was a man whose ambition was so visible, so loud, so undisciplined, that the only thing required to defeat him was to let him keep being himself. Grant let him write the bombastic dispatches. Grant let him alienate his subordinates. Grant let him publish the foolish self-promotion. And then, when McClernand had finally produced enough rope to hang himself, Grant calmly applied the noose. This is what Greene calls one-upmanship. And the principle is the most important one to recognize, because it is being used both for you and against you, constantly in your daily life. When someone wants to weaken your position in any group, at work, in a family, in a circle of friends, they almost never attack you directly. They do something subtler. They ask the small question that makes you defensive. They give you the small compliment that comes wrapped in a quiet implication that something is wrong with you. They make you feel slightly inferior, slightly insecure, slightly off balance, and then they step back and watch what you do. Because here is the trap. If you have any vulnerability at all, any insecurity, any vanity, any unhealed wound, being made to feel inferior in front of others triggers it. You overreact, you defend yourself too hard, you complain, you snap, you write the bombastic email, you make the embarrassing public claim, and the person who set you up has done nothing wrong. They didn't insult you, they didn't attack you, they just gave you a small push, and you fell down and hurt yourself in front of everyone watching. The defeat is yours. The witnesses who didn't see the original push only saw your reaction. How do you defend against this? The way Grant defended against it. Recognize that it's happening. The moment someone is consistently nudging you toward feeling inferior in public, the moment small comments are accumulating, the moment your insecurity is being deliberately probed, stop. Do not respond emotionally. Do not defend yourself loudly. Do not fight back. Just stay calm, do your work, behave with dignity. The person doing this to you is depending on your overreaction. Without it, they have nothing. They will be the one looking strange, making small comments that nobody else seems to notice, while you go on, unmoved, completely unbothered by them. Eventually, like McClernand, they will overplay their own hand, and you will not need to do anything to defeat them because they will defeat themselves. So you have the indirect game. Disappear when you cannot win directly. Get others to fight your battles. Refuse to react when someone is trying to make you react. These are not the strategies of confrontation. They are the strategies of patience, of not being where the fight is, of letting your opponent's own movement become the thing that destroys them. But there are still deeper strategies in this book, and these are the ones that operate so quietly, you almost cannot see them happening at all. Section 3. Quiet Conquest. In the middle of June 1940, a 49-year-old French general named Charles de Gaulle climbed onto an airplane in Bordeaux with almost nothing in his pockets and flew to England. France had just collapsed. The German army, in 6 weeks, had done what no army in history had managed to do: broken French resistance completely. The French government was negotiating surrender. Most of the French military leadership was preparing to cooperate with the German occupation. De Gaulle was almost the only senior officer who refused. He had no troops, he had no territory, he had no political authority of any kind. He had a uniform, a small suitcase, and a furious conviction that France was not finished. Winston Churchill, who barely knew him, allowed him to make a single radio broadcast on the BBC on June 18th, a short speech to whatever French citizens happened to be listening, telling them that the war was not over and that resistance was a duty. At the end of that first broadcast, de Gaulle did something Churchill had not authorized. He told the listeners he would be back on the BBC the next day. Churchill found out about this afterward. He was annoyed but didn't make a fuss. Pulling de Gaulle off the air now would look bad. So de Gaulle gave a second broadcast, and then a third. By the end of the first week, he had a regular slot. By the end of the first month, hundreds of French soldiers stranded in England were rallying to him. He named his nascent organization Free France. By the end of the year, he had several thousand men under arms. Then he asked Churchill for permission to liberate French colonies in Central Africa from the Vichy government, territories that controlled on the map vast swaths of the continent. Churchill, distracted by the Battle of Britain, agreed. De Gaulle's forces took Chad, then Cameroon, then the French Congo, then Gabon, almost without resistance. By 1941, de Gaulle controlled, by colonial accounting, an empire of millions of square miles. He used this to demand a seat at Allied strategy meetings. He was repeatedly refused. He pressed harder. He insisted publicly on French sovereignty. He behaved increasingly as if he were already the legitimate leader of France. In 1942, he sent an aide named Jean Moulin into occupied France to unify the French resistance, a chaotic patchwork of communist cells, socialist networks, and conservative groups who barely spoke to each other. Within a year, Moulin had organized them under de Gaulle's name. By 1943, de Gaulle had become so politically powerful that the Americans tried to replace him with a more cooperative French general named Henri Giraud. De Gaulle agreed to share power with Giraud on a French Liberation Committee. Then, while Giraud was on a state visit to the United States, de Gaulle quietly stacked the committee with his own loyalists. By the time Giraud returned, he had been outvoted on every position of importance. He resigned within months. When the Allies finally landed in France in June 1944, the question of who would lead post-war France was already settled. The man who, 4 years earlier, had flown to England with nothing was now, by international consensus, the legitimate head of the French government in exile. He returned to liberated Paris in August of 1944 and walked down the Champs-Élysées at the head of a procession that hundreds of thousands of Parisians turned out to see. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had, all along, considered him a difficult upstart they could remove whenever they wanted. By the time they realized they could no longer remove him, he was already there. This is what Greene calls the fait accompli strategy, and the principle is one of the most useful in the entire book. When you want something, a position, a role, a piece of authority, a territory in your professional life, almost no one will give it to you if you ask for it directly. Open ambition triggers resistance. The moment people see you reaching for power, they unite to prevent you from grasping it. It does not matter how qualified you are or how legitimate your claim, the visible reach is what produces the resistance. So you do not reach, you take small bites. Each bite is small enough that no individual person bothers to fight you over it. Each bite is small enough that viewed in isolation, it looks like a minor administrative matter. None of the bites by itself is worth a fight, but the bites accumulate. 6 months later, you have something. A year later, you have something bigger. 2 years later, you are sitting in the position you wanted, and the people who would have blocked you cannot remove you anymore, because removing you would now require dismantling something that already exists, and that is far harder than preventing it from existing in the first place. In your own life, this means something specific. When you want a major thing, a promotion, an expanded role, a new direction for your work, a change in a relationship, stop asking, stop arguing, stop making the case in big public speeches. Just start doing the small things that accumulated will mean you are already there. Take on the small task that lets you sit in on the meetings. Take on the next small task that lets you write the agenda for the next meeting. Take on the next small one that lets you decide what gets done. 6 months in, you are running the meeting. Nobody had to vote on it. Nobody had to approve you. You did it bite by bite, and the bites were so small that nobody saw a reason to stop you. But there is a quieter strategy still, and it is one of the oldest in this book. The strategy of changing minds without anyone realizing they have been changed. 2,500 years ago, in the city of Athens, a man with a flat nose and a stocky build walked through the marketplace, asking questions. His name was Socrates. He had no formal position. He owned almost nothing. He had taught at no school. He had written no books. He never wrote anything down in his entire life. What he did was this: he approached people in public, politicians, generals, merchants, young aristocrats, and started conversations with them. He always began the same way. He told them with apparent sincerity that he himself knew almost nothing. He praised the wisdom of the person he was about to talk to. He asked modestly if they would help him understand something he had been struggling with. His targets, flattered, agreed. Then Socrates would ask his question. The question was usually simple. What is courage? What is justice? What is virtue? The target would answer confidently. Socrates would nod, accept the definition, and then ask one small follow-up. I see, but what about this case? Does that fit your definition? The target would adjust the definition. Socrates would ask another small question. The target would adjust again. After 20 minutes, the target would suddenly realize, with a kind of vertigo, that they could not actually define the thing they had thought they understood completely. Their confident initial answer had collapsed under the weight of half a dozen polite small questions. They didn't actually know what courage was, or justice, or virtue. They had been operating their entire lives on confident-sounding words that, when examined, turned out to mean nothing they could pin down. Socrates never told them they were wrong. He never lectured them. He never insulted them. He simply asked questions, and the questions did all the work. His target would walk away from the conversation rattled, shaken, sometimes deeply angry. And then, over the following days and weeks, they would think. They would mull the questions over. They would slowly come to new conclusions. The new conclusions felt like their own, because Socrates had never told them what to think. He had only made them notice that they didn't in fact know what they thought they knew. By the time Socrates was sentenced to death in 399 BC, convicted by the Athenian state of corrupting the youth, he had quietly, through nothing but conversations in the marketplace, transformed an entire generation of young Athenian men. His student Plato would write down his method. Plato's student Aristotle would carry it further. Their ideas would shape Western thought for the next 2,000 years. This is what Greene calls the communication strategy. And the principle is something almost everyone gets wrong. When you want to change someone's mind, Your instinct is to argue, to make your case, to present the evidence, to explain persuasively why they should think differently. This almost never works. Direct persuasion triggers resistance. The moment your target sees that you are trying to change their mind, they reinforce the position they already hold. They argue back. They feel attacked. Even if your argument is better, the social cost of admitting you're right makes them dig in. The Socratic method, the indirect method, works differently. You do not tell people what to think. You do not present arguments at all. You ask questions, honest questions, questions that let them notice themselves, the gaps in their own reasoning. And when they reach a new conclusion, it feels like their own conclusion. Because in a sense it is. You did not put it there. You only created the space in which they could find it. In your own life, this is the difference between fighting people about ideas and actually changing how they think. If you want someone to see something they don't want to see, do not lecture them. Do not present the evidence in a 5-minute monologue. Ask them gently the small question that makes them notice the contradiction in their own position. Then stop talking. Let them sit with the question. Let them work it out. If they reach the conclusion you wanted them to reach, they will reach it as their own thought. They will defend it harder than they would defend something you told them. They will often forget that you were the one who started the process. Most of the people in your life who you have actually changed, who actually now think differently because of something you did, were changed not by your arguments, but by a moment when you let them notice on their own what you wanted them to see. But the strategy of quiet conquest goes deeper still. Sometimes the people you most need to influence are inside an organization you cannot enter, and the only way to fight them is from within. In Berlin, in the 1930s, a quiet, scholarly admiral named Wilhelm Canaris was promoted to head the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr. On paper, Canaris was a perfect Nazi appointee. He was a decorated naval officer, a conservative monarchist, an enemy of communism. He had publicly supported Hitler's rise. Hitler considered him reliable. By the time the Second World War began, Canaris was running the entire German military intelligence apparatus. He attended Hitler's strategy meetings. He had access to the most sensitive secrets of the Nazi regime. What Hitler did not know, and what most of the senior Nazi leadership did not know, was that Wilhelm Canaris had decided, sometime in the mid-1930s, that Hitler was leading Germany toward catastrophe, and that he, Canaris, was going to do everything he could to slow the regime down from the inside. He could not act openly. Open opposition meant the firing squad, and worse, replacement by someone who would actually do what Hitler wanted. So Canaris worked quietly. When Hitler ordered military operations, Canaris's intelligence reports somehow always emphasized the difficulties, the risks, the reasons for delay. When Hitler demanded to know what foreign powers were planning, the reports came back ambiguous, uncertain, full of qualifications. When Nazi party officials demanded that the Abwehr help arrest specific Jewish refugees in occupied territories, those refugees somehow received warnings just before the raids. When the Abwehr was ordered to provide intelligence on the Spanish government to help draw Spain into the war on Hitler's side, the intelligence Canaris produced just happened to suggest that Spain was unreliable and entry into the war would be a mistake, which is exactly what Hitler concluded. None of these acts, taken individually, was treasonous. Each could be defended as a genuine professional judgment. Canaris was just doing his job, conservatively, cautiously, by the book. But the cumulative effect was extraordinary. Operations that should have happened didn't happen. Decisions that should have been quick were slow. Intelligence that should have been clear was muddy. Canaris also used his position to quietly help individual victims of the regime, Jewish refugees, political dissidents, foreign agents he refused to expose. He maintained back-channel contacts with British intelligence. He passed information in carefully deniable forms to people who could use it against Hitler. He did this for almost 10 years. By the time the SS finally discovered what he had been doing, In 1944, the war was already lost. Canaris was arrested, tortured, and hanged in April of 1945, just 2 weeks before the war ended. Now think carefully about what Canaris did. He never raised an army against Hitler. He never gave a public speech denouncing the regime. He never quit in protest. He stayed inside the system, and, working from inside, he poured sand into the gears every day for a decade. He could not save Germany. He probably could not even change the outcome of the war, but he could slow things down. He could prevent specific operations from succeeding. He could save specific people from dying. He could make the regime, on the margins, less efficient at the worst things it was trying to do. And he did. This is what Greene calls the inner front strategy. And the reason it appears in this book, and the reason it is so important to recognize, is that it works in two directions. It is, on one hand, the strategy of quiet, principled resistance from within an organization you cannot leave or change directly. The strategy of the manager who shields their team from the worst decisions of executives. The strategy of the official who slow walks the policies they cannot openly oppose. The strategy of any decent person who finds themselves working inside an institution they cannot, for whatever reason, walk away from. But it is also the strategy being used against organizations all the time by people whose motives are not principled at all. In every workplace, in every institution, in every team you have ever been part of, there are people who behave loyally on the surface, who attend the meetings, follow the procedures, smile in the hallways, and who are quietly sabotaging the work of the people around them. They take credit for things they didn't do. They share information selectively. They forget to forward emails. They arrange for the project they don't like to fail by quietly removing one of its supports. They are termites in the structure. They are doing exactly what Canaris did, except they are doing it for petty reasons, against people who have never done them harm. How do you recognize this? By looking, over time, at outcomes. The person who is sabotaging from within rarely leaves obvious tracks. Each act, in isolation, is innocent, but if you look at the pattern over a year, 2 years, 5 years, you start to notice that the projects this person touches always seem to have problems. The decisions this person was involved in always come out ambiguous in a particular direction. The information this person was supposed to pass along never quite arrives in time. Once you start seeing the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And once you have seen it, you have to be careful, because the inner front saboteur has spent years building a reputation as the loyal team player, and any direct confrontation will look, at first glance, like paranoia on your part. You have to play their game, quietly, patiently, by restricting their access, by sharing less with them, by making sure the projects you care about most do not pass through their hands. You take away their ability to act, while never quite giving them anything to react to. This is the dirty truth about working inside any institution. The people who do the most damage are almost never the loud ones. The loud ones are visible. The loud ones are easy to deal with. The people who do the most damage are the ones who for years smile across the table and pour sand into your gears. So we have come through the strategies of quiet conquest. Take small bites until you are already there. Change minds by asking questions, not making arguments, and recognize, in the institutions of your life, the people who fight from inside. But there is one more section in this book, and it contains the two most extreme strategies of all. The strategy that gave us a saint, and the strategy that gave us a word. Section 4. The Endgame. On the morning of March 12, 1930, a frail 60-year-old man wearing nothing but a homespun loincloth and a pair of sandals walked out of a small ashram in the western Indian state of Gujarat and started to walk toward the sea. His name was Mohandas Gandhi. The British had nicknamed him Mahatma, the Great Soul. He had with him 78 followers, all of them dressed similarly, all of them carrying nothing but a small bundle of personal belongings. The road they were walking was 240 miles long. The destination was a stretch of beach near a village called Dandi. The British government of India, the Raj, was watching very closely. They had been informed in advance of every detail of what Gandhi was about to do. He had personally written to the Viceroy of India, Lord Edward Irwin, weeks earlier, telling him exactly when the march would begin, exactly what route it would take, exactly what would happen when it arrived at the sea. The plan was almost embarrassingly simple. Gandhi was going to walk to the beach. He was going to bend down at the water's edge, and he was going to pick up a single handful of natural sea salt. By picking up that handful of salt, he was going to break a British law. The Raj held a monopoly on salt production in India. Indians were not permitted to make their own. They had to buy salt, taxed, expensive, from licensed British producers. The salt monopoly was, in financial terms, a minor part of the Raj's revenue. In symbolic terms, it was something else entirely. Salt was essential. Every person in India needed it to live. The British had taken something the people of India literally could not survive without, and they had taxed it. As Gandhi walked, something unexpected began happening. People came out of their villages to join him, hundreds the first day, thousands by the end of the first week. By the time he reached the sea, 24 days later, a procession of tens of thousands stretched behind him for miles. Newspaper reporters from around the world were walking with the procession. Newsreel cameras were filming every step. The British, watching all of this, did not know what to do. They could arrest him. They had arrested him many times before, but arresting a frail, smiling old man who was only walking to a beach to pick up salt, in front of the cameras of the entire world, would make them look like exactly what Gandhi was accusing them of being, a foreign empire crushing the most basic dignities of a colonized people. So they did nothing. They watched. On April 6, in the early morning, Gandhi waded into the shallow water at Dandi, bent down and picked up a small handful of natural sea salt that the receding tide had left on the beach. He held it up in front of the cameras. The photograph went around the world. In the weeks that followed, the salt protest spread across India. Millions of people in cities and villages everywhere began making salt from seawater in defiance of the law. The British, finally responding, started arresting people. 60,000 Indians were jailed within the first few months. Gandhi was arrested in May. The arrests did nothing. The protests grew. Indian government officials began resigning. Indian police officers began refusing orders. By the end of 1930, the British administration of India was paralyzed. The Raj would last another 17 years on paper, but everyone in India, in Britain, around the world, understood that something had broken that year. The handful of salt at Dandi had broken it. Now here's the question Greene wants you to think about. How did this work? How did a frail old man in a loincloth with nothing but 78 followers and a strict commitment to non-violence defeat the most efficient empire in the world? He won because he made the British impossible to fight. If Gandhi had organized a violent uprising, the British knew exactly what to do. They had crushed violent uprisings before. Their entire colonial system was built around it. They had the soldiers, the police, the prisons, and the moral framework that allowed them to use force against people who had used force first. But Gandhi refused to let them have any of that. He gave them no violence to respond to. He announced his actions in advance. He did everything in public, in front of cameras, surrounded by witnesses. He smiled. He cooperated when arrested. He thanked his jailers. He went to prison without resistance and emerged without resentment. And every time the British tried to crack down, every time they sent police to break up a protest, every time they jailed a journalist, every time they used force against a peaceful crowd, they made themselves look exactly like the bullies Gandhi was claiming they were. They could not win. The harder they fought, the more they confirmed his accusation. This is what Greene calls passive aggression, though he uses the term in a way that is slightly different from how we use it in everyday speech. In Greene's framing, passive aggression is not the muttering, sulking, eye-rolling behavior we associate with the word. It is a coherent strategic approach. It is the deliberate use of non-resistance as a weapon, the recognition that in certain conflicts, the most powerful move is to refuse to fight on your opponent's terms, while continuing, calmly, to advance toward your goal. Now, here is the moral complication Greene wants you to sit with. Gandhi used this strategy for one of the most morally clear causes in modern history, to free his country from foreign occupation. The strategic shape of his action was admirable, and the cause was admirable, and the two together made him a saint. But the strategic shape, separated from the cause, can be used by anyone. It is being used in your daily life, every day, by people whose motives are not Gandhi's. The colleague who never says no, but somehow your projects always stall when they touch them. The family member who agrees to every reasonable request and then fails helplessly to do any of them. The partner who never argues, but somehow always gets their way through quiet, sustained non-compliance. The boss who is always supportive in public and somehow always undermining in private. These people are using a version of Gandhi's tool, the tool of non-resistance, of refusing to give you anything to fight against, for purposes that have nothing to do with justice and everything to do with personal control. How do you recognize when this is happening? One signal is reliable. Look at outcomes over time, not at intentions in the moment. The everyday passive-aggressive person, ask about any individual incident, will have a perfectly reasonable explanation for why they did what they did. Of course they meant to send the email, they were just busy. Of course they support your work, they just had concerns. Of course they're not undermining you, you're being paranoid. Each individual story is plausible. The pattern, over 6 months or a year, is not. If a specific person's involvement in your life is consistently producing outcomes you do not want, if their participation always seems to slow things down, undermine specific people, prevent specific decisions, then the pattern is the truth. The individual stories are decoration. You are dealing with someone using non-resistance as a weapon. How do you defend yourself? You cannot fight passive aggression with direct aggression. The moment you lose your temper, the moment you accuse them, the moment you raise your voice, you become the bad guy in their story, and they win. What you do instead is what the British eventually realized they should have done with Gandhi but couldn't. You stop giving the passive-aggressive person things to be passive about. You stop including them in projects where their cooperation is essential. You stop relying on them for information that matters. You stop placing yourself in any situation where their failure to act becomes your problem. You don't fire them. You don't denounce them. You quietly, structurally root around them. Eventually they discover that they have no leverage anymore because you have stopped giving them any. But there is one final strategy in this book, and it is the darkest one Greene includes. It is the strategy I told you about at the start of this video, the one that gave us a word. In the year 1092, in a remote castle called Alamut, perched on a cliff in the mountains of northern Persia, a religious mystic named Hasan-i-Sabah had a problem. He was the spiritual leader of a small Muslim sect, the Nizari Ismailis. His followers were devoted to him personally and to a particular interpretation of Islam that the surrounding Sunni majority considered heresy. Hasan had, over the previous decade, recruited several thousand converts and seized a handful of mountain castles in remote parts of Persia and Syria. By the standards of the great empires around him, he was nobody. The Seljuk Empire, which controlled the region, had a population of tens of millions and an army of hundreds of thousands. Hasan, at his peak, controlled perhaps a few thousand warriors. In 1092, the Seljuk vizier, a brilliant administrator named Nizam al-Mulk, decided that Hasan's growing influence was a threat that needed to be ended. He sent 2 armies to take Alamut and destroy the sect. Hasan, looking at the situation, understood that he could not win a conventional war. His followers, however devoted, would be massacred in any pitched battle. So he did something that had never been done before. He selected a single one of his most devoted followers, a young man trained from childhood for absolute obedience. He sent him alone, dressed as a wandering holy man, on a journey of several hundred miles to intercept the vizier Nizam al-Mulk on a road outside Baghdad. The young man approached the vizier's traveling litter peacefully. As Nizam al-Mulk leaned forward to receive what he thought was a religious blessing, the young man drew a dagger from his robes and stabbed him through the heart. He did not run. He did not try to escape. He stood beside the body and waited for the guards to seize him. They cut him to pieces on the spot. The Seljuk armies that had been marching on Alamut, leaderless now, fell into confusion. Within months, the Sultan himself had died from natural causes. The empire entered a decade of internal turmoil. The campaign against Hasan's sect was abandoned. When the empire eventually stabilized and tried again, in 1105, Hasan repeated the move. Another devoted follower walked alone into a public space. Another high official died with a dagger in his chest. The killer made no attempt to escape. He was tortured to death and his body was displayed publicly. Within a few years, the pattern was unmistakable. Anyone, any vizier, any judge, any general who proposed serious action against Hasan's sect had a way of dying suddenly, in public, at the hands of a man who didn't try to escape. The killings were rare. There might be only 1 or 2 a year. They came at unpredictable intervals. They could happen anywhere, in a crowded market, in a courtyard at midday, in a private bedroom at night. The empire was paralyzed. Officials began traveling everywhere with bodyguards. They wore chain mail under their robes. They refused to meet petitioners they didn't know. They became suspicious of their own servants, their own cooks, their own wives. Nobody could be sure who, in the household, might be a hidden Ismaili convert waiting for a signal. Wild rumors spread. Officials accused each other of secret allegiance to Hasan. Senior figures began denouncing rivals as Ismaili sympathizers, knowing the accusation alone could end a career. The empire began to consume itself in its own paranoia. Hasan and his followers, meanwhile, sat in their mountain castles, almost untouched. They were, by any conventional measure, a tiny force in a vast empire. But by killing perhaps a dozen carefully chosen people over 30 years, they had made the entire empire afraid to act against them. In 1120, a new sultan named Sanjar, having decided he would not be intimidated, began assembling an army to finally crush Alamut. He took extreme precautions for his own safety. He ate only food prepared by trusted cooks. He slept in a different room every night. He surrounded himself, day and night, with men he had personally vetted. One morning, Sanjar woke up alone in his locked bedchamber and found a dagger buried hilt deep in the wooden floor, a few feet from his bed. There was no sign of how it had gotten there. Later that day, a letter from Hasan-i-Sabah arrived at the palace. The letter said simply, "Did I not wish the Sultan well, that dagger, which was struck into the hard ground, would have been planted in his soft breast." Sanjar cancelled the campaign. He signed a peace treaty with Hasan that left Alamut and all its territories independent. The most powerful man in the Islamic world had been defeated by a piece of paper and a dagger in a floor. Hasan's sect, the Nizari Ismailis, would survive in Alamut for another 150 years. Their followers would become known throughout the Islamic world by the Arabic word for the hashish their enemies accused them of using, hashashin. European crusaders, encountering them in Syria, would carry that word back to the West. Slowly, over centuries, it transformed. Hashashin became assassino in Italian. Assassino became assassin in English. The word today means a killer who strikes carefully chosen public targets in carefully calculated public ways for political effect. That is what it has always meant. Hasan-i-Sabah invented it. Now this is the most morally serious story in the book. Greene includes it not because he admires Hasan. He doesn't. He includes it because Hasan invented something specific. a strategic technique that has been used in different forms by every terror campaign in the 1,000 years since. And because that technique is being used against you in a softer form more often than you think, look at how it works. You don't have to kill many people to terrify a population. You only have to kill the right people in the right way with enough unpredictability that no one knows when or where the next strike will come. The actual deaths are tactical. The fear they produce is the strategy. The fear ripples out from each act and continues working long after the act itself is over. The empire spent 30 years afraid of an enemy that, by simple count, had killed perhaps a dozen of its officials. The fear was the conquest. The fear was the war. In your own life, this principle is being used in much smaller, more everyday ways. By the boss who, every once in a while, not often, but often enough, fires someone in a public way that makes everyone else afraid. By the controlling partner who, every once in a while, has an emotional outburst dramatic enough that you spend the next month walking on eggshells, afraid of triggering another. By the social media mob that occasionally destroys someone's career publicly enough that millions of people quietly self-censor, hoping not to become the next example. The damage in each individual case is real, but the strategic effect is much larger. The few visible punishments do the work of disciplining everyone who watched. Most of the targets of this kind of warfare are not the people who got punished. Most of the targets are the people who saw the punishment and adjusted their behavior to avoid being next. How do you defend yourself when this is being done to you? Greene's answer is uncomfortable, but, when you sit with it, deeply true. You defend yourself by refusing to participate in the fear. Terror only works if its targets are afraid. The moment a person decides, quietly, internally, that they are not going to live in fear of an unpredictable threat, the strategy stops working on them. Other people may still be afraid. The terror campaign may still continue around them, but they, individually, are no longer captured by it. This is not a small ask. It takes real strength. It takes the willingness to accept that yes, something bad might happen to you, and you will deal with it if it does, and in the meantime, you are going to behave the way you would have behaved anyway. You are going to say what you actually think. You are going to take the action you would have taken. You are going to live in your daily choices as if the threat were not there. Almost nothing destabilizes a person who is using terror tactics like a target who refuses to be terrified. They depend completely on your fear. They do not have a backup plan if you simply decide not to be afraid. When you stop participating, the threat, which was always smaller than it appeared, shrinks back to its actual size, and you are suddenly free. So that is part 3. 11 strategies for the wars that are not clean. And with that, we have come to the end of all 33. Let's bring it together. Not just part 3, but the whole book. We've watched the Allies build a fake army out of rubber tanks to confuse Hitler. We've watched Hannibal trap 80,000 Romans inside a curved line at Cannae. We've watched a German monk break the Catholic Church by claiming the moral high ground first. We've watched an Oxford archaeologist bring down an empire with 200 camels. We've watched the King of France defeat his cousin without ever fighting him by quietly funding the Swiss to do it. We've watched a quiet, drinking general named Grant let an ambitious rival destroy his own career while doing nothing. We've watched a French general arrive in England with nothing and become the leader of post-war France through 5 years of small bites. We've watched a philosopher in a marketplace transform Western thought by asking small questions and pretending to know nothing. We've watched a Nazi admiral spend 10 years quietly sabotaging the regime he served. We've watched a frail old man in a loincloth defeat the British Empire with a handful of salt. And we've watched a religious mystic in a mountain castle invent the word assassin. 11 stories in this video, 33 across the trilogy. What does it actually add up to? It adds up to a way of seeing the world. Robert Greene's deepest argument across these 3 parts is that the world is full of conflict, far more of it than most people are willing to admit, and that almost nobody is taught to see it. We are raised to believe in cooperation, fairness, good faith, the idea that reasonable people working together can resolve their differences. Sometimes that's true, but often the people you are dealing with are not reasonable. They are running campaigns. They are pursuing goals you have not been told about. They are using techniques that have been refined for thousands of years to advance their interests at the expense of yours. The 33 strategies are how those campaigns work. If you have walked through all three parts, you now have something most people in your life will never have. You have a vocabulary for things that, before this book, were probably invisible to you. The colleague who is running a quiet center of gravity campaign against your reputation. The relative who is using moral high ground to make every disagreement your fault. The friend who is taking small bites of your time, your money, your trust, hoping that none of the bites are big enough to fight over. You can see them now, you can name what they are doing, and you can decide, in each case, what the right response is: direct confrontation, indirect maneuvering, quiet routing around, or the courage to walk away. If I had to leave you with 5 things from this entire trilogy, they would be these. First, the deepest battle you will ever fight is inside your own head. Master your own mind. Refuse to fight yesterday's wars. Stay calm when everyone around you panics. Cut off the escape routes that are keeping you small. None of the strategies in any of these 3 parts can save you if your own mind is the place you keep losing. Build the foundation first. Everything else rests on it. Second, most of life is not about winning fights. It is about choosing which fights to have it all. Almost everyone you know who looks exhausted, depleted, defeated, they are not exhausted by the wars they lost. They are exhausted by the wars they won that they never should have fought. Before you commit to any major battle, ask yourself what winning will actually leave you with. If the answer isn't worth the cost, walk away. Third, see the people in front of you. Not the imagined version, the actual person. Watch what they do, not what they say. Notice the patterns in their behavior over time. Build your strategy around who they actually are, not who you would have wanted them to be. Almost every defeat you have ever experienced happened because you misread the person across from you. Fourth, when you commit, commit completely. Half victories are slow defeats. The job you halfway quit, the relationship you halfway ended, the change you halfway made, the argument you halfway won, all of them are leaks in your life that drain energy for years. When you decide something matters, end it cleanly, fight it through, and finish what you start. And fifth, recognize that not everyone is fighting fair. Most of the people in your life who are quietly working against you will never declare war on you. They will smile, they will agree, they will appear to be on your side, and they will, in small invisible ways, be running campaigns against your interests every day. Once you have learned to see this, once the language of the 33 strategies has become a part of how you look at the world, almost nothing in your daily life will look the same. The people who used to confuse you become legible. The conflicts that used to drain you become navigable. The fights you used to lose, you stop losing. Not because you have become more aggressive, but because you have finally stopped being naive. That is what the 33 Strategies of War is for. It is one of the most useful books I have ever read. It is also, if you read it carelessly, one of the most dangerous. It can teach you to see manipulation. It can also tempt you to use it. The choice in every chapter is yours. Greene himself ends the book with a line that has stayed with me for years. He writes that the supreme strategist is not the person who wins the most fights. The supreme strategist is the person who has so completely understood the nature of conflict that they no longer need most of these strategies at all. They have developed enough self-knowledge, enough clarity about their goals, enough peace with the world as it actually is, that the wars other people are fighting around them simply pass them by. That is, in the end, the goal. Not to become the person who wins every battle, to become the person who has learned which battles are worth fighting at all, and which ones, with quiet wisdom, can simply be allowed to pass. If this trilogy has been useful to you, if any of these 33 strategies have hit something real in your life, Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War is one of the deepest books on conflict ever written. The full book is available on Amazon and Audible, and links are in the description. Parts 1 and 2 are on this channel. Part 1 on the inner war and the foundation. Part 2 on the offensive arts. Watch them in order if you haven't already. They were built to fit together. As for what's next, I'll keep doing this. There are too many great books on this channel's list to count. If you've made it all the way through this trilogy with me, thank you. Subscribe and stick around. The next book is already waiting. Until then, see clearly, choose carefully, move with patience, and when you finally move, move all the way. I'll see you in the next one.